Some choose a life of adventure, others have adventure thrust upon them, and for still others, adventure is simply a necessity and a way of life. But how does that influence us as we are attempting to kit out and outfit our characters? Greetings, adventurers. My name is Kramer, and some of you probably have the exact same problem that I have when it comes to finding new equipment for our characters, which is, how do you really choose what it is that you're going to bring on your adventure? And I think this is somewhat a byproduct of the way that tabletop role-playing games and video games are structured, which is that I like to focus on the stats, and perhaps you do too. It's just like, what is the best weapon we compare? Well, this one has like a longer reach, this one. But I think when we really boil it down, we are kind of ignoring the context, because there are lots of different types of adventures you could go on, and there are lots of different types of adventurers too. Now, kind of what I would consider to be the original adventuring party, which I believe has inspired games like Dungeons & Dragons, which combines wizards and rangers and warriors and rogues and The Lord of the Rings. For those characters in The Lord of the Rings, the call to adventure sort of came to them and then they had to answer. But for a lot of us who are playing Dungeons & Dragons or LARPing or going out into the wilderness just to go on a hike, we don't necessarily have like that quest which has been bestowed to us. Those are very rare. Not often do you find yourself sitting at a bar and the bartender happens to say that there are goblins around you that need to be destroyed, and then you get all kitted out and then you go. That is to say that with very rare exception, for us, adventure is not ever really thrust upon us. Rather, we are choosing to go out in search of adventure, which is kind of contradictory to what Tolkien writes about in The Lord of the Rings, where Sam and Frodo are having a conversation, and they comment that once this is over, they would like nothing more than to go home. So the problem has arisen because we are not thrust into the adventure. We get to actively choose what adventures we want to go on. What is it that we actually bring? And I've received a lot of questions recently, both from subscribers and members of my Patreon, like, you know, I'm trying to create a ranger character. You know, what sword do you think looks the most rangery given the rest of my kit and what I'm looking for? So I've come up with 3 archetypes for different types of adventurer that I think is going to be very helpful as we are trying to decide, do I bring an arming sword? Do I bring a long sword? Do I bring a war bow? Do I bring a hunting bow? Because these are questions that I think all of us want answered. So the very first type of adventurer archetype that I can think of, and these should not be confused with like character classes, say like in Dungeons & Dragons, because classes and subclasses will all fit into any one of these archetypes. And while most character classes will sort of lean towards one archetype over another, you could mix and match however you want and come up with some really creative character ideas. We'll get to that in a little bit. So the archetypes that I've come up with are, there are warriors, there are explorers, and there are wanderers or wayfarers. I haven't really decided which one sounds better to me, so go ahead and let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you like wanderers or wayfarers? So we'll start with warriors. Now, a warrior is a type of adventurer that actively goes out to seek combat. Think monster hunters like Geralt of Rivia from The Witcher. These are people that are going out specifically with the aim of getting into fights. They're looking for trouble, whether that is very low-level characters going out and fighting bandits, or if you're going to clear out a goblin encampment, or if you're going to fight a dragon, you are going, and the adventure's goal is to face down some sort of enemy with your weapons. Now, these types of characters are going to be kitted out in the way that makes most sense based upon their class. So you might not necessarily have a wizard decked out in full plate, but if you were a fighter in the warrior archetype, you would wear the best armor available to you. And that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's going to be wearing plate or something like that, though I would say that probably we should be, but that could be any type of armor. It could be bought, could be homemade, could be scrounged together and scavenged. But as a warrior archetype, going out with the express purpose of finding combat and then engaging in it, you're going to want to be the best equipped that you can be. Ultimately, this raises some questions about like whether or not adventurers are technically actually military or whether or not they are civilians. I do have a video about this sort of concept of guilds being sort of sponsored by the government. I think it's an interesting idea. But for most of us, in the context that we're going in, adventurers are actually civilians. So when it comes to role-playing, creating your characters, creating your worlds, it might be interesting to see, you know, what equipment is actually legal for civilians to own in your setting, because that will affect what it is that you as your character or the characters that you're writing about are actually able to carry. Now, the second type of adventurer is the explorer, and this is somebody that doesn't necessarily want to engage in combat, but can if it happens. Maybe you try to avoid it if you can, but the purpose of an explorer is quite simply in the name. Your goal is to explore, is to travel the lands, go to places that people don't usually go to. You're gonna wanna be self-sufficient. And so if combat arises, you're gonna wanna be able to take care of yourself, but you're not necessarily going to go out of your way to engage in a 1v5 versus some bandits. Think about a character like Aragorn's ranger persona, Strider, where he is armed, he is certainly capable, he is self-sufficient, and he is traveling around Middle-earth. He is a ranger. So ranger, explorer, they're very synonymous, but it's not always that all rangers are explorers all of the time. We'll get to that later. So if you're playing an explorer type character, rather than focusing on like how much armor can I physically carry with me, how much can I wear all at once, what is the absolute best weapon if I'm going to be getting into combat, you want to consider kind of like the least amount of military gear that you can physically get away with without over encumbering yourself. So you can see right now that I'm sort of straddling the line between an explorer and a wanderer character, which we will get to, but I am wearing a gambeson. I have a smaller bow. I have my bastard sword here. So I would consider myself capable. I'm not ready to go to war, but I am able to defend myself. I'm not just a regular traveler. I'm more well armed than a regular civilian just going to market would be. Now, if I were to take this and then try to turn this kit into a warrior kit, I would start adding much more armor. Probably switch out the sword and switch out the bow for a more powerful combat-ready bow rather than a smaller sort of survival-focused bow that maybe could defend you at a pinch, maybe not, depending on the creature. And finally, we come to the wanderer or wayfarer, and these are people that are not going out specifically to search for combat and are not going out specifically to travel the terrain and see where life takes them either, but rather they are traveling from settlement to settlement. And for this, we sort of have to separate the idea of travel from adventure. They're not completely different things, but for the warrior, the travel is sort of the means to the end, and the combat is the adventure itself. And for an explorer, the traveling is the adventure, and then everything just happens along the way, and the whole thing is the adventure. But for the wanderer, the traveling is to get to the adventure, which then happens in a civilized location like a castle or a city or a small town. And I'm thinking of wandering wizards like Gandalf, who does, sure, travel over the countryside, but that's not really why he's there. He's going to Hobbiton, he's going to Rivendell, he's going to Gondor to look up old manuscripts about the One Ring. These are characters that require civilization in order to ply their adventuring trade. Another good example of a good wanderer type character is, of course, a regular civilian person going on a pilgrimage. That would be very historically accurate. So from the historical perspective, wanderers and wayfarers are the most historically accurate style of adventurer. You go from one town, you ask for direction to the next one, you travel along a well-trodden road for that day, you get to the next place, and then you set up, and then eventually you reach your destination, and then you go home. That's what most adventures would have been like in the medieval period. I say adventures, those would certainly be adventures. I mean, like traveling across a countryside where there's like only a couple farmers and like pretty much nothing else, that is an adventure, and I would love to do that. But compared to some of the more fantastical adventures we have in our games and media, they definitely seem a lot less exciting than having bandit fights every 5 seconds and orcs chasing you and a dragon boss fight all the way at the very end. But alchemists, clerics, physicians, craftsmen, merchants, all of these could be considered, you know, wanderer archetypes just at base level. But now we'll get into how we can sort of mix and match some of those things to make kind of interesting combinations. So you could have a fighter class character that is of the wanderer archetype. And that would mean that perhaps you're not going out in search of fighting bandits, but rather you are traveling from settlement to settlement, perhaps as a professional duelist. And that means that you're probably not going to have the same armor as a fighter in the warrior archetype. You're going to be armed such that you are successful in going from one town to the next and dueling for coin. Or as my example here, as I am kitted out, you could have an explorer or a wanderer ranger that is going around either from settlement to solve small problems around their groundskeeping, kind of like a historically accurate human might do, although they probably weren't traveling from settlement to settlement, they just had their own area. Or an explorer type ranger where I'm not necessarily going down to hunt goblins, but rather I'm just going to see what the terrain is, if there are goblins, and then report back, sort of a scouting role. Or you could have the warrior style ranger, kind of like the Athelian rangers. They're militarized, they have war bows, they have war equipment, and their goal is to scout with the express purpose of fighting in a battle. So in this context, if we think about a warrior being something like a knight errant, or an explorer being, I don't know, a treasure hunter, a character like Indiana Jones or something like that. And then we think of a wanderer as being a bard, like Jaskier from The Witcher. We can now start to understand what exactly those characters are going to be doing on their adventures, what they're going to be doing while they're traveling, and therefore what it is that they need to carry. So for instance, the sword that I have on right now, which is a LARP version of my real sword, these are almost 1-to-1 in terms of dimensions. I don't carry this sword if I'm just going for a hike or a camping trip, because when I'm doing that, I'm essentially playing an explorer style character. And this is it's just too much to carry. It's not particularly heavy, but it just is cumbersome, and the LARP version is too, despite it being much lighter. The dimensions of it are just not suited to exploring and traveling around. So if I were to try to climb some of the desert rocks that are around me currently, this would make that almost impossible. And for playing an explorer style ranger, I am looking to essentially replace this with a shorter arming sword, something like this, because it just makes it so much easier to get where I need to go. And it still gives me that defense if I encounter combat, but as an explorer, you're not trying to find combat and then engage in it, where you'd want something like this, or probably even a much longer sword, or like a true war sword. And if you're a wanderer and you're focused more on like the social aspect of civilization for your adventuring, you may not want to carry very much in the way of weapons at all, and maybe focus more on like the civilian style, like self-defense weapons that we have historically, something like a basilard or a small messer or falchion, something that would technically be considered a long knife and may not raise as many eyebrows when you're going into new settlements. You don't want to encounter questions, and the more people that like you as a bard or a wandering wizard or a potion maker, probably the better business you're going to do. Whereas for an explorer, a sword this small, sword, knife, this small is probably not really going to be enough if you do find yourself in a position where you really need to defend yourself against someone that's much more well-equipped who's trying to rob you. And this sword, and my experience with it, is a great sobering reminder that the characters that we play are people, and they're going to do what is practical for them. They're not going to just wear the same thing all of the time. You're not going to just wear your armor all of the time and all of your armor all of the time just because, well, it's what my character wears. That's not really how it works. If I'm going somewhere where I think I would need this, obviously I would take it. But if I'm going somewhere and I know for certain there is no way I'm going to need this, I'm not going to take it. It's just far too much trouble. No matter how cool it makes me feel, the practicality should have a level of importance to us. And of course, with all things, it is a little bit of a risk. You certainly may find yourself in a situation where you wish you had that sword, but you don't, because you didn't think that you were going to need it, so you brought something much smaller, and now that's all you have. I have a lot of weapons on my floor now. I say that as if that isn't always the case, though. So if you've picked an archetype that you are going for, and you're not quite sure whether or not your kit is there, you just have to ask yourself, if you're playing a warrior, if push came to shove, would I actually want to fight with what I'm wearing and what I'm carrying? And if the answer is no, then you need to go back to the drawing board. Or if you're playing an explorer, if push came to shove, would you actually be able to climb a mountain or a tree or run a very long distance in this kit? And if not, then something needs to change, and the same thing goes for a wanderer. So it's possible that if you are in the warrior archetype, your adventuring party would be made up of other members of the warrior archetype. And then that way you're all well equipped and you all know how the armor works and you can sort of work together as a fighting unit to complete tasks much easier. At that point, you're essentially a band of mercenaries. Or, very much like the Lord of the Rings, you can have a combination of the different archetypes all in one group. So not only is everyone there for different reasons, but you also have different skill sets based on the classes that you are, and that is what makes for the D&D dynamics that we are also very used to. And for dungeon masters, game runners, or novel writers, this also provides a great way for loot to be distributed, rather than just finding random things and then everyone just sort of min-maxes and decides what it is that they like, or based on their backstory or whatever. Think of Aragorn, right? So I would classify Aragorn, Strider, as an explorer character for like the first half of the story of the Lord of the Rings. He's got a small hunting bow. We're talking about the movies at this point. He's got a small hunting bow, and he has his ranger sword, and he's got pretty much no armor, aside from the van braces that he takes from Boromir at the end of Fellowship. And then, when he enters a situation where he knows that there is going to be combat, what does he do? He gets chainmail, and he puts it on. He armors up and then goes further into the warrior style of that ranger persona for the Battle of the Hornburg. And then finally, at the very end, when he's going to face Sauron again, he knows that there's going to be combat. He gets another upgrade, which is to have full plate armor for that battle. And along the way, he also gets a much better sword too. So these are strategic character upgrades based on the circumstances of the story. They're not just sort of random things that pop up and then he has to decide, well, do I like my ranger sword or do I like Narsil better? Which one has like the better stats? It's like he gets it when he's supposed to get it according to when he needs it. And I'm not suggesting these by any means be like hard and fast rules that you have to follow and you have to pick one and like stick to it. This is just something that popped into my head, which I thought would be helpful for people, specifically as we're attempting to choose what kit and what garments we are bringing on our adventures. So take from this video what is useful to you and just disregard completely whatever is not useful to you. And you could, of course, have a character that straddles the line between two or even all three of these archetypes, or you could come up with a completely new archetype that works well for you, but the important thing is to define what type of adventurer you are so that you have the data that you need to know what it is you actually need to bring. Because for people like me that like to be over-prepared, it means that you are also over-encumbered. And you have a lot of things that are like nice and like you could use in an emergency, but you don't really need to carry it with you. That could be an adventuring archetype. The pack mule. You just carry everything. Also make sure you're doing research as you're figuring out what you think you want your archetype to be, what other characters from fiction or historical jobs existed where people were actually doing those things. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be from the medieval period. You can always take inspiration from other time periods. Maybe there's a medieval equivalent for a tool that existed in the 19th century that didn't exist in the medieval period, but they had something else that served a similar purpose. You would probably want to have that. So for my example, if I'm going to try to create a warrior style ranger for a fantasy scenario, I would be looking at historically accurate archers, probably in the medieval military, to see what sort of kit that they had. And the very first thing, of course, that jumps out is that all of them had helmets, and rangers as depicted in fantasy scenarios generally don't wear helmets at all. So this will have to be something that I address and contend with at a later date. So on that note, I've been playing a lot of Kingdom Come Deliverance, and it's made me kind of want to try out a more warrior-focused kit to begin with, not like the leather armor that I usually use or have made for myself, because I'm actually not convinced that for a ranger, leather armor is actually the right choice. So that'll be a later video, and I'm gonna try and really kit myself with like real, proper, historically accurate steel armor, and we're gonna see where that takes us. But until that time, I'd like to wish you good luck on your adventures. And a special thank you to all of my patrons whose names are appearing on the screen. If this video spoke to you, please consider becoming a member on Patreon with the link in the description. Thank you for your support.